The man who divorced me because he said I was too ugly to stand beside him forgot he was holding a cup of hot coffee the moment he saw my face on the cover of Vogue. I watched it happen through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Delta Sky Club at LaGuardia Airport. Marcus Brooks stopped in front of the magazine stand so suddenly that the businessman behind him nearly walked into his suitcase. His eyes stayed fixed on the cover while the coffee slowly tilted in his hand until it spilled across the polished floor. He never noticed. The cashier handed him a stack of napkins, but he kept staring at the magazine as though the woman smiling back at him belonged to someone else. In a way she did. 2 years earlier, he had looked at that same face across a courtroom and calmly explained why he no longer wanted to be married to it. My phone vibrated on the table beside me. "Boarding begins in 20 minutes, Eleanor's message read. "The New York team cannot wait to meet you." I smiled, locked my phone, and looked toward Marcus one last time. There was no anger left inside me. No desire to walk over and prove anything. The cover had never been revenge. It was simply evidence that the person who understood my worth the least had spent 11 years convincing me he understood it the most. Watching him finally realize that truth was strangely quiet. 2 years earlier, silence had felt very different. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and burnt coffee from a vending machine outside the waiting room. Marcus sat across from me in a perfectly tailored navy suit, straightening the cuff of his shirt while our attorneys reviewed the final documents. He looked relaxed, almost relieved. I looked at the silver wedding band resting on my finger, and wondered when it had started feeling heavier than comforting. The hearing lasted less than half an hour. 11 years of marriage disappeared into signatures, initials, and polite legal language. No one raised their voice. No one cried. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak arrives wearing perfect manners. When the judge finalized the paperwork, Marcus thanked everyone in the room before turning toward me. "Naomi," he said gently enough that anyone listening would have mistaken him for a kind man, "I really hope you understand this was never about your heart." He hesitated just long enough to make sure I was listening. "You are a good person. But somewhere along the way, you stopped trying. I cannot spend the rest of my life pretending attraction does not matter." The words landed with the quiet precision of someone repeating an opinion he had rehearsed many times before. The painful part was not hearing them that day. It was recognizing them. They sounded exactly like hundreds of smaller comments scattered across the previous 3 years. "Maybe wear something darker. That dress is not very flattering. You used to take better care of yourself. You should let me stand in the middle of the pictures." None of those sentences sounded cruel by themselves. Together, they slowly became the voice I heard every time I looked into a mirror. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, picked up his briefcase, and offered me a sympathetic smile. "I really do hope someone appreciates you one day." Then he walked away believing he had left with dignity. I remained seated until everyone else had left the courtroom. My attorney quietly asked whether I needed a few more minutes. I thanked her, said I was fine, and waited until the room became completely empty before allowing myself to breathe normally again. Outside, October sunlight covered the courthouse steps while people hurried through ordinary afternoons that had nothing to do with my broken marriage. A father lifted his little daughter out of a stroller. 2 construction workers laughed about something neither of them would remember tomorrow. Somewhere nearby, someone dropped a stack of folders, and loose papers scattered across the sidewalk. The world had not paused simply because mine had changed. I unlocked my car and placed the divorce papers on the passenger seat. As I reached for the ignition, my phone lit up with a calendar reminder I had forgotten to delete. Dinner with Marcus. 7 o'clock. I stared at the screen until it faded to black. Then I opened the calendar, deleted the reminder, and noticed another event scheduled. For the following Saturday. Recharge camera batteries. I did not even remember creating it. For a moment my hand rested on the steering wheel while an old memory quietly surfaced, one I had not thought about in years. I had no idea that forgotten reminder, not the divorce itself, would become the first step toward the life waiting for me beyond everything I thought I had lost. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, the townhouse looked exactly the way it always had. The flower pots by the front steps still needed watering. The porch light Marcus had promised to replace weeks earlier still flickered every few seconds. From the outside, Nothing suggested that the marriage inside had officially ended less than an hour earlier. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the quiet hallway, and instinctively waited to hear the television playing in the living room. Nothing. The silence felt unfamiliar, not because the house had become empty, but because I realized it had been emotionally empty for much longer than either of us had admitted. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and noticed 2 coffee mugs still sitting beside the sink. Mine had a tiny chip on the handle from a camping trip years before. His looked brand new because he always replaced things the moment they showed signs of wear. For a few seconds I simply stared at them. Then I washed my mug, dried it carefully, and placed it in a moving box labeled kitchen. It stayed exactly where it was. It was the first decision I had made entirely for myself in a very long time. My phone buzzed with messages from my sister Denise, my best friend Ava, and 2 coworkers asking whether I would still be coming into the office on Monday. I typed the same reply to all of them. I will be there. Work had always been the one place where I still recognized myself. I solved problems, built campaigns, led presentations. People listen when I spoke. Looking back, it amazes me how confidently I could guide million-dollar branding projects, while quietly believing my own reflection needed someone else's approval. Upstairs, I opened the bedroom closet and found Marcus's side almost completely empty. He had packed most of his belongings during the previous week while I stayed late at the office preparing for a client presentation. At the time, I told myself he simply wanted to make the transition easier. Now I understood he had already left long before the paperwork made it official. I reached toward the top shelf to grab an empty storage bin when my hand brushed against something covered in dust. It was my old camera bag. For a moment I simply looked at it without touching it. Then I carefully lifted it down and unzipped the faded canvas. Inside rested the same professional camera I had saved almost 14 months to buy before Marcus and I were married. I remembered every extra freelance job, every Saturday wedding, every community event I photographed just to afford it. Back then, photography had never been about making money. It was the way I paid attention to people. I loved photographing the seconds between posed smiles, when someone forgot they were being observed and simply became themselves. Those were always my favorite pictures. After the wedding, I photographed less and less. There was always another work deadline, another business dinner, another reason to postpone something that only belonged to me. Eventually the camera found its way into this closet, where it quietly waited through 6 birthdays, 6 Christmas mornings, and countless ordinary Tuesdays. I pressed the power button out of habit. Nothing happened. The battery had been dead for years. I almost put the camera back into the bag before noticing something tucked inside the front pocket. It was a folded checklist written in my own handwriting. Recharge camera batteries. Organize portfolio. Submit New York application. I smiled faintly. The reminder I had deleted from my calendar only an hour earlier had come from this list. I had completely forgotten making it. At the bottom of the page, beneath every unfinished goal, I had written one sentence in blue ink. Do not let your dreams expire while you are busy building someone else's. I honestly could not remember writing those words. Somehow the woman I used to be had seen my future more clearly than I did. Downstairs my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I answered before I could change my mind. She did not ask what the judge had said or whether Marcus had been kind. She asked only one question. Have you eaten today? I looked toward the untouched refrigerator and realized I had not. She was quiet for a moment before saying something she had repeated throughout my childhood whenever life became overwhelming. Baby, do the next small thing. After we hung up, I made myself a simple grilled cheese sandwich, washed the plate afterward, and carried the camera into the living room instead of returning it to the closet. I thought I was only moving it from one room to another. I did not realize I had just moved my life in the same direction. The following Saturday, I drove to the same camera shop I used to visit almost every month before I got married. The building looked smaller than I remembered, squeezed between a neighborhood bakery and an old bookstore that somehow still survived in a world where everyone bought everything online. A little brass bell rang when I opened the door, and the familiar scent of leather camera straps, printer paper, and freshly brewed coffee instantly carried me backward 6 years. Behind the counter stood an older man polishing the lens of a vintage film camera. He looked up, smiled, and tilted his head. It has been a long time, he said before I even spoke. I blinked in surprise. You remember me? He chuckled. You used to come in every few weeks asking about lenses you could not afford yet. That is hard to forget. I laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in months. I finally bought the camera, I said, placing it carefully on the glass display case. Then I forgot I owned it. He nodded as though that sentence carried a meaning much larger than photography. After replacing the battery, he handed it back to me without saying anything else. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a date from nearly 6 years earlier before asking me to reset the clock. Felt strangely symbolic. Some things only need a little power before they remember exactly what they were built to do. Before leaving, I walked slowly around the shop studying framed photographs hanging along the walls. None of them showed celebrities or dramatic landscapes. One captured an elderly man laughing while teaching his grandson to fish. Another showed a waitress wiping flour from her cheek before opening her bakery for the morning. Ordinary people. Ordinary moments. Yet every photograph felt unforgettable because someone had bothered to notice them. As I reached the front door, the owner called after me. Can I give you one piece of advice? I turned back. Do not spend the next 6 years photographing the life you think you should have. He pointed toward the camera hanging from my shoulder. Photograph the one you are actually living. I thanked him and walked outside into the cool autumn air. Instead of driving home, I followed a quiet instinct and headed toward Riverside Park. Families filled the walking trails. Children chased pigeons across the open lawn. An older couple shared a paper bag of popcorn while watching ducks drift across the water. Nobody noticed the woman quietly lifting a camera toward them from a respectful distance. For nearly 2 hours I photographed nothing extraordinary. A father kneeling to tie his daughter's sneaker. Steam rising from 2 paper coffee cups resting on a bench. A golden retriever shaking water across a dock while its owner laughed. I remembered something my photography professor had once told me in college. Anybody can photograph beautiful people. The real challenge is making ordinary life impossible to ignore. That afternoon I finally understood what he meant. When I arrived home, I transferred every image onto my laptop. My old photography software asked whether I wanted to restore my previous workspace. I clicked yes without hesitation. Familiar folders slowly appeared across the screen, including one I had completely forgotten existed. It was labeled New York Portfolio. Curious, I opened it. Inside were nearly 40 edited photographs I had prepared years earlier for the interview I never attended. I sat there scrolling through them in complete silence. They were not perfect, but they were honest. More importantly, they reminded me that I had once believed I deserved opportunities without asking anyone else's permission first. I spent the rest of the evening editing the new photographs from Riverside Park, then uploaded 6 of them to the personal portfolio website I had not logged into since before my wedding. I almost closed the browser without pressing publish. My finger hovered above the mouse for several long seconds. Old fears have a way of disguising themselves as practical decisions. Finally, I clicked the button, shut my laptop and carried my coffee mug to the sink. By the time I woke the following morning, one of those 6 ordinary photographs had quietly traveled much farther than I ever imagined. Sitting in my inbox was an email with the subject line, "Who is Naomi Brooks, and why have I never seen her work before?" The email arrived at 6:42 on Sunday morning, while I was still standing barefoot in my kitchen waiting for the coffee maker to finish brewing. The subject line read, "Who is Naomi Brooks, and why have I never seen her work before?" For a moment I assumed it was another marketing message that had slipped past my spam filter. I almost deleted it without opening it. Something made me hesitate. I tapped the screen instead. "Good morning, Naomi. My name is Eleanor Price, and I am the creative director at Ashford Editorial Group. One of our contributing photographers sent me your portfolio after seeing your recent uploads. I spent most of last night looking through your work. You have a rare ability to notice people before they notice themselves. If you have time this week, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee and hear the story behind these photographs." I read the message 3 times before setting the phone down beside my coffee mug. Then I picked it up and read it again just to make sure I had not imagined it. The invitation felt unreal, not because someone liked my photographs, but because I had uploaded only 6 of them less than 12 hours earlier. I spent the rest of Sunday trying not to think about the email. I cleaned the apartment, bought groceries, answered work messages, and even reorganized the hallway closet. Every few hours my eyes drifted back toward the phone lying face down on the kitchen counter. By evening I finally admitted the truth. I was not afraid Eleanor would reject me. I was afraid she would actually believe in me. Monday morning arrived with the familiar rhythm of meetings, presentations, and deadlines. Just before lunch my manager stopped beside my desk. "The Henderson account loved your campaign," she said. "They specifically mentioned your presentation." I thanked her politely, but as she walked away I realized something strange. Complete strangers trusted my professional judgment every single day. The only person whose opinion I continued questioning was my own. During lunch break I replied to Eleanor's email with a single sentence. "Coffee sounds wonderful." She answered less than 10 minutes later. We agreed to meet Saturday morning at a small cafe overlooking the river, halfway between my apartment and the Ashford offices. The cafe was already busy when I arrived. Couples shared breakfast near the windows while college students worked quietly behind open laptops. Eleanor stood as soon as she saw me walk through the door. She looked to be in her early 50s, wearing a navy blazer over a simple white blouse, with silver-framed glasses resting lightly against warm, thoughtful eyes. Nothing about her seemed intimidating. She smiled the way people smile when they are genuinely interested instead of merely being polite. For the first 20 minutes we barely talked about photography at all. She asked about my work in branding my family, and what first made me pick up a camera. I told her about photographing neighborhood festivals in college, saving every freelance paycheck for my first professional camera, and how I loved the quiet moments people usually overlooked. Finally she asked the question I had been quietly expecting. "Why did you stop?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup before answering. "Because life became busy." Eleanor smiled gently. "That sounds like the answer you give people you do not know very well." I laughed because she was absolutely right. After a long pause, I told her the truth. I explained how my marriage slowly became smaller than arguments and larger than silence. How every casual comment about my appearance eventually became the voice inside my own head. How I quietly abandoned pieces of myself one reasonable compromise at a time. I never once called Marcus cruel. I did not need to. The pattern spoke for itself. Eleanor listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding but never taking notes. When I finished, she looked out the window toward the river for several seconds before speaking. "You know what I noticed first about your photographs?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nobody in them is pretending." She looked back at me and smiled. "That tells me the photographer finally stopped pretending too." Before I could respond, she reached into her leather portfolio and placed a thin folder on the table between us. Across the front, printed in simple black letters, were the words "Second Chapters." "This is a project we have been developing for months," she said quietly. "Stories about people who rebuilt their lives without becoming someone else in the process." I opened the folder and slowly turned the pages filled with interviews, editorial concepts, and sample layouts. Then I looked up. "You want me to photograph this?" Eleanor smiled and gently shook her head. "Eventually, yes. But first, Naomi, I think one of the stories we have been looking for has been sitting across the table from me all morning." I took Eleanor's folder home and placed it on my kitchen table beside my camera. For the next several days, neither of them moved. Every morning I made coffee, glanced at the folder, then headed to work promising myself I would think about it later. Every evening I came home tired enough to invent another excuse. Fear has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as practicality. I told myself I should wait until work became less demanding. I should organize my portfolio first. I should become a better photographer. I should feel more confident. Deep down, I knew none of those things were the real reason. I was afraid someone might look closely at my work and quietly confirm every doubt I had spent years believing. The following Thursday, I finally opened the folder again. Eleanor had included detailed notes about the project, submission, requirements, and a handwritten message clipped to the front page. "Do not overthink this. Just show us the photographs only you could have taken." I read that sentence 3 times before walking into my home office. An old external hard drive rested in the back of my desk drawer beneath tangled charging cables and forgotten notebooks. A faded label across the top read, "Portfolio 2018. I connected it to my laptop, One by one, hundreds of photographs slowly filled the screen. Street musicians in Chicago, farmers at a weekend market outside Nashville, a father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle, an elderly couple dancing in a public square during a summer festival. I noticed something immediately. None of the photographs were technically perfect. Some were slightly underexposed. Others could have been framed better. But every single image felt alive. They had been taken before I learned to question every creative instinct I had. As I continued scrolling, I found a document titled Goals Before 40. I smiled the moment I recognized my own handwriting. Travel to Iceland. Teach photography workshops. Photograph an editorial feature. Publish work in a national magazine. Photograph a magazine cover before turning 40. I laughed softly at the last line. It sounded wonderfully unrealistic. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into my notebook instead of putting it back inside the drawer. That evening I selected 24 photographs, added 6 new images from Riverside Park, and uploaded everything to a private gallery. My finger hovered over the send button longer than I cared to admit. Finally, I typed Eleanor's email address, attached the link, and wrote only one sentence. Thank you for believing there might still be a story worth telling. Then I clicked send before I could change my mind. The next morning I checked my inbox before I even poured my first cup of coffee. Nothing. By lunchtime, still nothing. I told myself editors were busy. By Friday evening I had stopped opening my email every 15 minutes, but I still glanced at my phone whenever it buzzed. Saturday passed. Then Sunday. By Monday afternoon I quietly convinced myself the silence was probably the answer. I did not feel devastated. I felt embarrassed for allowing myself to believe that one weekend of photography could reopen a door I had closed years earlier. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. I buried myself in client presentations, strategy meetings, and campaign deadlines. On Wednesday morning my manager congratulated me after a successful pitch, yet I caught myself wondering why praise at work always felt easier to accept than praise for something I truly loved. Late that afternoon, while packing my laptop to go home, my phone lit up with Eleanor's name. I stared at the screen for a second before answering. Hello. She sounded almost offended. Naomi. Why have you not answered your email? I frowned. I have been checking it all week. Check again, she laughed. I opened my inbox while she stayed on the line. Somehow a message had been filtered into a promotions folder I almost never opened. The subject line read, "Forwarded to New York Editorial Review." My heart skipped. You found it? Eleanor asked. I laughed in complete disbelief. Apparently my email did not. She laughed with me before her voice softened. The editor finished reviewing your portfolio yesterday. She asked me one question. I swallowed quietly. What was it? Eleanor paused just long enough for my imagination to create a dozen different answers. Then she said, she wants to know whether you would be willing to fly to New York. She believes your photographs deserve a much bigger conversation than either of us originally planned. The flight to New York landed on a cool Monday morning beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. As the taxi crossed the Queensboro Bridge, I caught my first glimpse of the Manhattan skyline and felt something I had not experienced in years. It was not confidence. It was curiosity. 2 years earlier, I would have looked at those buildings and quietly wondered whether I belonged among the people working inside them. Now I found myself wondering what I might learn from them instead. Ashford's New York editorial office occupied several floors of a restored warehouse overlooking the Hudson River. The lobby walls displayed decades of magazine covers, each one telling a different story about a different life. I recognized actors, athletes, musicians, and business leaders, but I barely glanced at them before following the receptionist upstairs. Eleanor was already waiting near the conference room with 2 cups of coffee. You made it, she said with a smile. Barely, I joked. I still cannot believe I am here. She handed me one of the cups. Good. Stay that way. The people you are about to meet are interested in honesty, not performance. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, yet no one asked the questions I had rehearsed answers for. No one wanted to know how much weight I had lost after the divorce. No one asked whether I regretted my marriage. Instead, the senior editor placed one of my photographs on the table. It showed an elderly man patiently buttoning his wife's coat before they crossed a busy street. "Why this one?" she asked. I studied the image for a moment before answering. Because he was paying attention to her instead of wondering who might be watching. The editor smiled but said nothing. She simply wrote a note in the margin of her notebook. Another editor opened my interview transcript and looked across the table. "There is something unusual about your story," she said. "Most people describe the moment their lives changed. You keep describing ordinary days." I laughed softly. Because that is where my life actually changed. I told them about deleting an old dinner reminder from my calendar after the divorce. About washing a single coffee mug while packing the townhouse. About finding my camera in the closet. About standing in Riverside Park photographing strangers who had no idea they were helping me remember who I used to be. None of those moments seemed dramatic when they happened. Together, they quietly became a new beginning. After lunch, the editorial team reviewed the first draft of the feature, while I waited in a nearby lounge overlooking the river. I resisted the urge to check my phone every few minutes and instead watched ferries glide across the water. An hour later, Eleanor joined me carrying the marked-up manuscript. She looked pleased but thoughtful. "Good news?" I asked. "Very good," she replied. "They barely changed your story." She paused before adding, "They changed the scope." We returned to the conference room where the editor-in-chief folded her reading glasses and smiled warmly. "Naomi," she began, "Second Chapters was designed as a collection of several personal stories." She tapped the manuscript resting in front of her. "After reading this, we no longer believe that is the right format." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "What does that mean?" She leaned forward slightly. "We want to expand your feature into a standalone profile. More reporting. More photographs. More space to let readers stay with your journey." For a second I forgot how to respond. Eleanor quietly squeezed my shoulder before the editor continued. "Nothing is guaranteed beyond that," she said carefully. "The editorial board still has final approval. But everyone in this room believes your story deserves the opportunity to be considered for something much bigger." During the flight home, I rested my forehead against the window and watched the clouds drift beneath the wings. I did not spend the trip imagining magazine covers or television interviews. Instead, I kept thinking about something the senior editor had said just before I left. "The strongest stories are never about proving someone else wrong," she told me. "They are about finally telling yourself the truth." When I landed, life returned to its familiar rhythm. I went back to work, photographed quiet weekends, answered client emails, and deliberately stopped refreshing my inbox every hour. Weeks passed. Spring slowly replaced winter. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone lit up with Eleanor's name. The moment I answered, I heard the excitement in her voice before she spoke a single word. "Naomi," she said, almost laughing, "the editorial board made its decision this morning. I think you should sit down before I tell you what happened." I sat down before Eleanor finished her sentence. Something in her voice told me this was the kind of news a person should hear with both feet firmly on the ground. I stepped into an empty conference room overlooking the city, closed the glass door behind me, and rested my notebook on the table. Through the windows below, people hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and grocery bags, each one living a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Mine had just become anything but ordinary. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear papers shuffling on Eleanor's desk and the faint sound of conversation somewhere beyond her office. Finally she laughed, unable to hold it in any longer. "The board voted this morning." I smiled despite myself. "You are making this feel like an award show." "In a way it is," she replied. "Naomi, they approved your story for the cover." The room became completely still. I looked out the window without really seeing anything below. A delivery truck turned onto the corner. Someone waited patiently at a crosswalk. Life continued exactly as it had 30 seconds earlier, yet everything inside me had shifted. "Are you still there?" Eleanor asked gently. "Yes," I whispered. I never imagined hearing those words." She let the silence settle before speaking again. "There is something you should know. During the final meeting, one of the editors asked why your story deserved the cover instead of an inside feature." My heart skipped. "What happened?" Eleanor smiled. The editor-in-chief answered before anyone else could. She said, "Because readers will not remember the magazine. They will remember how this story made them feel about themselves." I closed my eyes. That sentence meant more to me than the cover itself. Never once had I hoped to become someone famous. I had only hoped that if my story reached another woman quietly questioning her own worth, she might decide not to abandon herself the way I once had. The following weeks became a careful balance between extraordinary opportunities and wonderfully ordinary routines. During the day I still led branding meetings, reviewed campaign strategies, and answered emails from clients who had no idea my evenings were filled with editorial revisions and photography selections. Every few days Eleanor would send another draft for approval. Together we removed anything that felt exaggerated. We rewrote entire paragraphs whenever a sentence sounded too polished. Readers trust honesty, she reminded me more than once. Leave them room to recognize themselves. One afternoon the editorial photographer invited me to review the final image selections. We spread dozens of large prints across a long conference table. Some had been taken in Riverside Park. Others showed me walking through my neighborhood carrying the same worn camera that had once gathered dust in my closet. One photograph immediately caught my attention. I was standing outside the small camera shop, laughing at something the owner had just said. I had not realized the photographer was taking pictures at that moment. My shoulders were relaxed. My smile was unplanned. Nothing about the image looked perfect, yet everything about it felt true. "That one," I said quietly. The photographer nodded. It was everyone's favorite. Publication day arrived in early October. I was flying to New York for several interviews connected to the feature, so I arrived at LaGuardia Airport before sunrise carrying my camera bag, a small suitcase, and the same notebook that still held the list of goals I had written years earlier. Most of those goals now had neat lines drawn through them. I stopped inside the Delta Sky Club long enough to answer a few congratulatory emails before boarding. As I slipped my phone into my bag, movement near the magazine stand outside the lounge caught my attention. Marcus. He looked almost exactly the way he had on the day we finalized the divorce, wearing another perfectly tailored navy suit and pulling a black carry-on behind him. He walked toward the display without looking up until one magazine stopped him in his tracks. His hand reached for the cover almost automatically. The paper coffee cup he had been carrying tilted slowly until it slipped from his fingers, spilling across the polished floor. A nearby employee hurried over with paper towels, but Marcus never looked down. He stared at the cover, then opened the magazine and began reading. Even from across the terminal, I could see the expressions quietly changing across his face. Curiosity gave way to disbelief. Disbelief softened into recognition. Then came regret, not loud or dramatic but unmistakable. For the first time in 11 years, he was seeing me through eyes that belonged to no one but himself. My boarding announcement echoed through the lounge. I picked up my suitcase and stood for a moment longer. I realized I no longer wanted him to understand what he had lost. I simply wished he had recognized my value before the rest of the world had to show it to him. As I turned toward the gate, Marcus slowly lifted his eyes from the magazine and instinctively looked around the terminal, as though hoping the woman on the cover might somehow still be there. Marcus's eyes slowly swept across the terminal, searching the crowd as though he expected the woman from the magazine to step out from behind one of the boarding gates. For a brief moment, his gaze drifted toward the glass wall separating the Delta Sky Club from the main concourse. I instinctively took a small step backward, more from habit than necessity. A family pushing a stroller crossed between us, and the moment quietly disappeared. He never saw me. My boarding group was announced a second time. I picked up my carry-on, adjusted the worn leather strap of my camera bag, and walked toward the gate without looking back. 2 years earlier I would have stopped. I would have wondered whether this was fate giving us one final conversation. Now I understood something different. Closure had already happened long before we stood in the same airport. It happened the day I stopped measuring myself against someone else's expectations. By the time I settled into my seat beside the window, the terminal had already begun fading behind the rain-speckled glass. As the plane climbed above the city, I finally opened my phone. More than 100 unread messages waited in my inbox. Some came from former classmates I had not spoken to in years. Others were from complete strangers who had found the article that morning. One woman wrote that she had postponed applying to medical school 3 different times because she believed she was no longer capable of starting over. Another message came from a father who admitted he had spent years making careless comments about his teenage daughter's appearance without realizing how deeply they stayed with her. A young photographer from Oregon wrote only a single sentence. "I picked up my camera again today because of your story. I answered as many messages as I could before the plane landed. None of those people thanked me for appearing on the cover of a magazine. They thanked me for reminding them that rebuilding a life rarely begins with one extraordinary moment. It begins with one ordinary decision repeated often enough to become a different future." The interviews in New York lasted 3 days. Every television host, podcast producer, and magazine editor eventually asked the same question in one form or another. "How did it feel knowing your ex-husband finally saw the cover?" At first I smiled because I understood why they asked. It sounded like the ending everyone expected. My answer, however, never changed. "That was his moment," I would say. "Mine happened much earlier." They usually leaned forward, waiting for something dramatic. Instead, I told them about deleting an old dinner reminder from my calendar after the divorce, washing a single coffee mug before packing the townhouse, charging a forgotten camera battery, photographing strangers in Riverside Park, sending a portfolio I almost never submitted. Those were the moments that quietly rebuilt my life. The magazine cover simply arrived much later. By the time I flew home, I noticed something that surprised me. I had spent 3 days talking about the article without thinking about Marcus once. Healing had not arrived with applause or headlines. It had arrived so gradually that I only recognized it by noticing what no longer occupied my thoughts. 2 weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday evening, I stopped at the neighborhood grocery store after work. My shopping basket held coffee beans, fresh strawberries, sourdough bread, yogurt, and pasta for dinner. I was comparing 2 jars of tomato sauce when I heard someone quietly say my name. "Naomi." I turned around. Marcus stood a few feet away holding a shopping basket with bread, eggs, milk, and fresh spinach. He looked healthy but older somehow. Not in appearance, but in the way disappointment can soften a person's confidence. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he offered a small, uncertain smile. "Congratulations," he said. "I read the article." "Thank you," I replied. The conversation felt strangely calm, almost like speaking to someone I had once known rather than someone who had once defined my life. Marcus glanced toward the floor before looking back at me. "I kept thinking about something you said." I waited quietly. "You wrote that you slowly forgot your own voice because you spent too much time listening to someone else's." He took a slow breath. "I realized you were talking about me." "Partly," I answered honestly. "But I also let it happen. That part belonged to me." He nodded, accepting the answer without trying to defend himself. After another brief silence, he spoke again. "I owe you an apology. Not because your life turned out well. I owed you one long before that." His words were careful, free of excuses, and for the first time since I had known him, completely unguarded. "I confused preference with truth," he said quietly. "I made you believe that if I could not see your value, it was not there. I was wrong." I believed him. Not because the apology erased the past, but because it asked for nothing in return. Then he looked at me with a quiet hope I recognized immediately. "Would you have dinner with me sometime?" I rested my hand lightly on the handle of my shopping basket before answering. "No." I smiled gently, hoping he would hear kindness instead of rejection. "I truly hope you build a good life, Marcus. I really do. But I had to lose the version of myself that needed your approval before I could become the person standing here today. I cannot ask her to go backward." He lowered his eyes, nodded once, and let out a slow breath. "I understand." This time I believed him. We wished each other well, then quietly walked in opposite directions down the same grocery aisle. As I stepped outside a few minutes later, the cool evening air greeted me with the familiar scent of rain on warm pavement. I loaded my groceries into the car, placed my camera bag on the passenger seat beside them, and smiled to myself. 2 years earlier I thought freedom would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt wonderfully ordinary. 1 year later, the framed magazine cover no longer occupied the wall above my desk. A few months after the interviews ended, I moved it onto a bookshelf beside my camera, not because it meant less to me, but because it no longer needed to remind me who I had become. Every photograph on that shelf represented a quiet decision that mattered far more than a single publication ever could. Life eventually returned to a rhythm I had once believed was impossible. Monday mornings began with creative meetings and client presentations. Wednesday evenings were reserved for editing photographs at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside my laptop. Saturday mornings belonged to the community photography workshop I had started teaching twice a month. The classes were small, usually no more than a dozen people, but I loved watching complete strangers slowly become confident enough to trust what they saw through their own lenses. One Saturday afternoon, after everyone else had packed their cameras and left, a young woman lingered near the classroom door. She looked to be in her early 20s and held an older camera so carefully it seemed almost borrowed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking. "How did you know you were finally good enough?" I smiled, not because I had an easy answer, but because I remembered asking myself almost the same question years earlier. Instead of answering immediately, I handed her my camera. "Look through the viewfinder," I said. She raised it toward the large studio windows where the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. "What do you see?" "The room," she answered. "Exactly." I stepped beside her. "The camera only shows what you choose to point it toward." For years I pointed my attention toward one person's opinion. Eventually that became the only thing I could see. Changing my life started with changing where I looked. She lowered the camera slowly, nodded to herself, and smiled with the quiet relief of someone who had just realized she did not need permission to begin. After she left, I packed my equipment into the same camera bag that had once spent 6 forgotten years collecting dust in a closet. The leather strap I had bought after visiting the camera shop in New York was beginning to soften from constant use. Tiny scratches covered the metal corners of the camera body. Looking at them made me happier than seeing it brand new ever had. They were evidence of a life being lived instead of postponed. That evening I drove to my mother's house for dinner. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken, fresh rosemary, and warm bread. The same comforting combination I remembered from childhood. As everyone cleared the dishes and drifted into the living room, my mother stopped me in the hallway and quietly slipped her arm through mine. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I laughed. "That seems to be today's theme." She smiled. "Are you happy?" This time I did not need to think about the answer. "Yes." She studied my face for a moment before nodding. "I know." There was nothing else to say. She had watched me lose myself one compromise at a time, and now she was watching me return in exactly the same way. Later that night I arrived home, changed into comfortable clothes, and made one last cup of coffee before bed. The apartment was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the bookshelf. I sat by the window overlooking the city lights and opened the notebook that had traveled with me through every chapter of the past 2 years. Inside, folded between its pages, was the list I had written before my marriage slowly convinced me to postpone my own dreams. Travel to Iceland. Teach photography workshops. Publish an editorial feature. Photograph a magazine cover before turning 40. Every goal had been crossed out. At the bottom of the page, written smaller than the others, was one final sentence I had almost missed the first time I found it. Become someone I am proud to meet. I uncapped my pen, smiled to myself, and drew one final line through the last unfinished promise. Then I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the camera sitting beside it. I thought back to the day I walked out of the courthouse believing the best years of my life were already behind me. I remembered deleting the dinner reminder from my calendar, washing a single coffee mug, finding an old camera in the closet, standing in Riverside Park photographing strangers, and almost talking myself out of sending one simple email. None of those moments felt extraordinary while I was living them. Together, they quietly became the turning points that changed everything. People still ask whether the most satisfying moment of my journey was watching Marcus freeze in front of the magazine stand at LaGuardia Airport. They always seem disappointed when I tell them no. That was never the ending of my story. It was simply the moment another person finally saw what I had spent 2 years learning to see for myself. The real ending happened much later, on an ordinary evening in a quiet apartment, when I realized I no longer needed a magazine cover, an apology, or anyone else's admiration to believe I was enough. Marcus once told me I had stopped trying. The truth was that I never stopped trying. I simply stopped trying to become the woman he wanted and finally became the woman I had promised myself I would be. Looking out across the city lights, with my camera beside me and tomorrow waiting quietly on the calendar, I understood something I wished I had known years earlier. The most beautiful chapters of our lives rarely begin when someone else chooses us. They begin the day we finally choose ourselves.